So welcome to part 2 on APA papers. And again, draft 1, which we're working on up until about the middle of the semester, is just your title page, your introduction, and your method section. So we talked about the introduction section and kind of initial setup. And I do want to note that the current APA style actually has the sections being bolded. So I know that I mentioned them not being bolded in the previous lecture. I do apologize for that. Unfortunately for me, I've been dealing with APA style for 5 editions. So sometimes I need to double check myself. And sometimes those older instructions get through. Once again, I want to stress that this is an overview of APA style. The specific instructions are going to come in your lab, and those are the ones that I want to make sure that you follow. So the method section is generally going to be about 2 to 4 pages long. And again, what I really want to stress here is that when we're talking about the actual set itself, the title should be methods. It should be bolded and center aligned. And then level 2 subheadings will be participants, materials, and procedures. These should be bolded and left aligned. Everything in the method section should be in the past tense. In other words, when someone's reading your final article, you will have already done this study. So even though you're writing it sometimes before your study, it isn't going to be shared with people until after your study is completed. Therefore, it should be past tense. Like I said, the method section should contain 3 subheadings. The participants. In this section, you're going to describe your participants. So you're going to give descriptive statistics of any of the demographics you collected. You're going to talk about how you recruited them, and you're going to talk about the number of participants that were in your study. Your next section is going to be your materials. You're to describe the materials, the surveys, the questionnaires you used, any instructions that you gave, and any debriefing or informed consent forms that you used. And again, we'll discuss these in lab, but basically, materials is where you may actually then have additional level 3 subheaders for your various materials, your job satisfaction survey and the survey of the construct that you're interested in, not to mention the potential of a demographics form. Any materials you use are going to get their own section. So even though in the participant section, you'll list the demographics you actually gathered, in the material section, if you collected demographics, you would actually list what demographics you collected. Did you collect age? Did you collect year in school? Did you collect information about ethnicity? Those would be information that you would provide in the material section. And for each of your actual materials, for example, your surveys, you're going to say where you got it from, how many items are in it. You're going to give a few examples of the items. You're going to tell people how the items were responded to. For example, were they a Likert scale where people responded with strongly disagree to strongly agree to a question or an item? If so, you're going to tell them that's what you did. And finally, you're going to provide where you got the scale or the materials you're using from. So did it come from a previous study? If so, cite it. Or did you create it? If so, state it. And if it came from a previous study and that study gave you information about how rigorous it was, in other words, if they gave you statistical information of how trustable the material was, the survey, you'd provide that as well in this section. The final third section of the method section is design and procedure. And this really is, you're just going to walk people through, if someone actually participated in your study, what would they experience? How would they find out about the study? How would they sign up for the study? What would be the first thing they would see, which would probably be an informed consent that basically informs them about their ethical rights. They would then participate, they would then be exposed to the various surveys or questions you would ask, and you'd probably end with your demographic form and, if necessary, a debriefing form. So you're basically going to simply describe your research design and procedure, including how the independent variables were manipulated in a step-by-step account of your study. Now again, this is where that 2 to 4 pages come into. The participant section is probably going to be, at minimum, a moderately long paragraph, probably close to a page. The materials are probably going to be at least 1 paragraph, potentially more, for each material. In this case, you're probably going to have 3. Your job satisfaction survey, the survey of the construct of interest that you're researching, and your demographics. Each of these would probably be approximately a half a page to a page long. And finally, the walkthrough of what it would be like to take your study will probably be about, again, a moderately long paragraph. This is probably going to result in 2 to 4 pages of length. If you have less than 2 pages, you probably have not gone into enough detail. And again, the method section is where we're going from theory to observation. The introduction was your theory. It's where you were talking about constructs. It's where you were talking about relationships. It's also where you were talking about previous research that's found relationships between these variables and how they found it. Your method section is discussing your operationalization. What are you doing in your study? What are you measuring? How are you measuring it? And how are you looking at it? Now, we're not actually looking at the relationship yet. That's results. But we're giving someone enough information that they basically could closely approximate your study based on the information in your method section. And that's the main goal of the method section. You want to present enough information in enough detail so the reader could replicate your research. That doesn't mean you need to give every minutia. That doesn't mean you need to provide every scale, every item you used. But you need to give enough information that they could come reasonably close to replicating your study simply from the information in the method section. Make sure that if you are actually using any materials that have been used or created by other people, that you cite the sources of those measures, manipulations, or procedures that have been designed by someone else. So the next section in the paper is actually going to be draft 2. We're not really going to be talking about that to the second half of class, but again, this is your broad introduction to APA style. So the results section, the format, the word results should be bolded and center paste. So basically it's a level 1 header. Everything in the results section also should be in the past tense. It is a study that has already occurred. Any statistical symbol should be italicized. Basically, if it's initials, italicize it. So if it's an M for mean, italicize it. If it's an SD for standard deviation, italicize it. If you ran an R test, italicize the R. If you're reporting the p-value, italicize the p. The second thing to recognize is that when presenting statistical information, include spaces around any numerical operators. So equals, less than, plus, anything that actually is an information about the numbers themselves should have a space on either side. What should you include in your results section? You should basically provide the statistical test that you ran. So what did you run? What kind of test did you conduct? You want to provide the numerical results of that test, the data, and we'll be talking about how to present that information in our lab as we talk about statistics. Once you've actually provided the test that you ran, the actual numerical results of that test, you now need to actually put it into direct language, including whether or not it supported your specific hypothesis. So what were you testing? How did you test it? What were the results? And did it support or not support your hypothesis in clear language? So if you found a relationship, what does that relationship mean? As one variable goes up, does the other one go up as well? Then you talk about that in those plain and direct language. This should not be yet an interpretation of the results. So you're not actually telling people what the results mean or how they result back, or how the results reflect back on your introduction. You're simply giving the results. Here's what I found. Here's how I found it, and here's whether it supported or didn't support my hypotheses. And here's what that relationship I found means in common, easy, direct language. The next section is where we're going to start talking about what do these results mean. How long should the results paper section be? For this paper, we're probably looking at approximately a page. You're running a simple correlational analysis. So really all you're looking at is at most probably 2 paragraphs. What you were looking for, how you tested it, what you found, and what it means. The discussion section, the word discussion should be bolded and center aligned. And what includes here is now we're going to talk about the interpretation of the results. So how did these results either support or unsupport your hypotheses? What was your hypotheses? And you want to tie this back to previously cited research. Does your findings basically support previous research, or do they call into question previous research? Once you've actually discussed what the meaning is, you want to talk about the limitations. How could the study have been done better? And remember, always rigor, in other words, rigor, the best that we could possibly conduct a study is always going to be at odds with practicality. And for this class, there's definitely a lot of limits on practicality. So you can talk about those limitations. So what were things that could have been done better if you had had more time, more effort, or potentially even just more ability to control what you did in this study? Then you want to talk about the future research directions. So what would be the next obvious studies that you would want to conduct if you were going to continue to study this research interest that you had and the constructs of interest that you're interested in. And finally, you're going to end up with an implication section. How can this information result in real-world change? So we talked about the introduction section being a funnel where you start broad and you end with your specific hypothesis that then results in your methods. The results are then what you actually found. The discussion section is kind of like an upside down funnel. As you come out of the results section, you're going to reiterate what you found, but you're going to interpret it. You're going to then tie it back to previous research. You're going to talk about how it could have been done better, and you're finally going to end with what does this actually mean for the broader theories that you built on? How does this address your question? And now that the question's been addressed, how could individuals use this information to make the world a better place? So broadly speaking, just a reminder that what we're looking at is the structure of research, and the structure of research is often referred to as an hourglass. We start with a broad theory, a research question, we focus on a hypothesis through our lit review, and then through the methods, we go into specific operations. From those specific operations, we conduct our study and we observe, and that is our method section and our study. We then analyze the data and the results, we reach our conclusions in our discussion, and then we generalize back to the question and theory at the very end of our paper. So this broad concept of the structure of research then ties in to some of the concepts we're going to talk about later in this class, including internal validity. How rigorous is your study? How certain are you that the findings that you found actually are meaningful? And external validity, based on those findings, can you actually generalize back to the population that you're interested in? Just because you found it in your sample, does that mean we'd find it in other samples? And from the viewpoint of a research paper, we start with our introduction, we talk about the problem, we review past research, we then summarize into our hypothesis, we then provide the methods, the results, and the discussion. And again, this follows along this same pattern. So once we're done with the actual discussion section, we're going to have the references. The word references is at the top of the page, center aligned and bolded. The references should be in alphabetical order based on the order of the first author. After the first line, there should be a hanging indent. So you don't indent the first line, you indent all additional lines. We should have the various authors, their last name followed by a comma, followed by the initials of their first and potentially middle name. Once all authors are listed, we should have our publication year. Then we present the title. The title should be, the first word should be italicized, or not italicized, sorry. The first word should be capitalized. Any additional words that are not proper nouns would not be capitalized. We then have the actual name of the journal and its volume number, and these should be in italics. Then we have the page range, and finally the DOI if available. Sometimes they'll be provided, sometimes they won't. A quick note on Google Scholar. Google Scholar has a wonderful little option where you can click to get the citation, and it even lists one of them in APA style. Do recognize when using this function, it is being done by an automated series of basically, it's not being done by a person. It's basically gathering the information through some kind of search bot looking through the article. One of the things that's often missing is the page range. A lot of times when you use Google Scholar, you'll get the start page, but nothing else. That is unacceptable for APA style. You are going to have to go back in and try to find a PDF of that article and find out what was the actual page range and include that in your reference sections. I have a few examples of some references here, and we'll definitely talk about APA references and citations in lab. So again, if you're doing a reference within the text, basically there's two primary ways to do it. You can either list the authors, and if you're listing the authors first, for example, Nadler and Stockdale found, referencing a specific citation, you would have the names of the authors, no middle names or first names and initials, just the last names, and the word "and" spelled out, and then the year of the study in parentheses. If you were citing multiple studies by the same authors from the same year, you would have a lowercase a, b, or c after that year to represent if it's the first citation, the second citation, or the third citation. That's not very common, but it's worth noting. The other way is you simply provide what they found. For example, men are more likely to harass other men. And then after the statement, cite parentheses, Nadler, ampersand. So again, we're not spelling out "and," we're using a symbol. the second or third or fourth or fifth or how many offers there are, comma, the year, and then close that parentheses. You can find a lot of information on how to cite various items in various places on the website that's listed here. And again, we will be going over this in lab. You may want to provide a table in APA style. This particular assignment does not require a table, but if you were, here is an example. So we would have a table by number. That would be the first line. We would then have the actual title of the table in italics, and then the table would look like this. This is an APA style table. Any notes about the table would be beneath the table. And again, notice that we're all still in double space, and we're all still in 12-point Times New Roman font. Your paper will require a figure, which will be mentioned in the results section. And again, we'll be going over how to create figures in lab. The format of the figure should be axis of graphs properly labeled. So if you have an XY graph, you need to have the labels of what is X and what is Y. The title of the figure actually goes below the figure. And then figure number, and then italicized the period and the figure's number. So for example, figure 1 would be in italics underneath the actual figure itself. And then you'd have a title not in italicized. And again, we'll go over this. Generally speaking, when you refer to a figure in text, you'll actually have parentheses, see figure 1, close parentheses, and figures will usually be provided in individual pages after the reference section. The final section of your paper will be an appendix. The format, the word appendix is on the top of the page, centered, aligned, and bolded, and then a letter, appendix A, appendix B, etc. Appendices do not require you to follow APA formatting, double spacing, etc. I would suggest, if at all possible, continue using Times New Roman 12-point font. However, the appendices are usually going to be the actual materials you used. So if you used a job satisfaction survey, you would have Appendix A, job satisfaction survey. Appendix B would be the survey you guys created as a part of this study. If there were other additional materials that were important for the study, they would also be in the appendices. The one thing that I want to stress on the appendices is some students figure that because they have appendices with their actual materials, they don't need to go into any kind of real detail on what those materials look like in their method section. This is not correct. The appendices are an additional resource for people and often will not be published if the article gets published in an actual peer-reviewed journal. Think about the various articles you reviewed for your introduction section. Probably none of them included appendices, or if they did, it was fairly rare. So the appendices is a good opportunity for you to provide someone that's reading your paper the actual materials you used, but that does not give you an excuse to not describe those materials in detail in your method section.